Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got a really interesting conversation, a conversation that we all not only need to hear, but we need to really think about. We're going to talk about how to keep your buyers from shutting down, how to keep your buyers from keeping you at bay until the very latter stages of the buying process. That just wasn't the case, even in recent history. Right. This is one of the biggest challenges that we face in the business today. And so we have on today Cliff Quicksell. Now, Cliff, you've got a long tenured background in the marketing and sales industry, and you currently have your own consulting business, and you're the CEO of that company. But what I'd love to do is talk to you before we dive right in here, a little bit about lessons learned along the way in your journey, in your career. You and I both kind of shared before we started talking here, some of the times the things that are the most seminal moments to us, our learning lessons, are where we fail, right? So I'd love to just turn over to you for a minute here and explain a little bit more about your background, and then we'll get going.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me. Well, one of the things that I believe that honesty and credibility go hand in hand. And I want to say for your listeners, I know many of them are probably sitting there going, come on, Quicksell, really? But that really is my last name. So I just wanted to clear the air with that. So, no, we were talking before we started, and it is interesting that, a lot of people always ask you about your successes, but many people fail to ask, did you have any failures along the way? And as you and I were discussing, I almost went bankrupt 5 times in my speaking and consulting practice. And it was tough. I will tell you, it was one of the toughest, bleakest periods of my career. And I think it was a lot of it had to do with I was very, ashamedly saying, I was very arrogant at the time. And I wanted to say that I owned a business. And I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready at all. And when I look back on it, I think if I had done things a little bit differently and I was a little bit more patient and I was willing to listen a little bit more, boy, I wouldn't have had such a rocky road. Although, as you and I discussed, it really helped mold me to who I am today in business.
Well, one of the most key things you said there is listen more. And we're going to talk about that big time today. But, it's the kind of thing where when we fail, we're forced to do something. We're forced to really evaluate what happened, right? What didn't we do right? What could we have done better, right? And when things are going along okay, we don't do that wholesale evaluation, right? And that's where significant learning really happens. So I think we're going to go through a lot of those learning lessons, but apply it in today's marketplace, right? And, Gartner, Forrester, everybody's talked about how the buyer's like well over 70% of the way through the buying journey before they ever even want to talk to us. One thing that does, right, it puts more onus on marketing than it ever has before. Because if they're waiting to want to talk to us, our goal is how do we get earlier in the buyer's journey? Right. And by doing that's marketing, right? That's producing the right content that creates the right kind of intrigue and conversations, right? So before we get too deep, though, I just want to say, tell me, in your opinion, why are the B2B buyers shutting us out? Why are they shutting down? What's your opinion about why they're waiting so long to talk to us?
Quite frankly, I feel that B2B buyers are overwhelmed. I really do. I think many of them, since COVID, a lot of people are wearing multiple hats. And I think that they're stretched. And I think with the combination of being stretched and having a lot of challenges heaped up on their backs, like their demands for accountability, demands for success, I think a lot of times people are very gun shy about pulling the trigger because they're fearful, will this work? I note in my practice when I work with people and I help them build creative marketing campaigns, most of them don't do it because they're afraid of failure. And I think it may be a little bit different from a B2B buyer, but I just feel that they're overwhelmed at this point in a major way.
There's no doubt about it. We're overwhelmed in our business lives. We all have 150% of what we can really do in a day. But there's like this level of skepticism that's creeped in. And, we called it the trust gap. And there's plenty of studies, LinkedIn, Edelman, their trust index. Trust is going down worldwide like this. Worse in the United States, go to Europe, though, it's just declining. And things that are coming out of those kind of studies is that the majority of B2B buyers think that we are intentionally being misleading. There was another study that came out that said 74%, that's 3/4 of B2B buyers, don't trust the customer evidence we present to them. But yet that's how we represent the value that we create, right, for our clients.
It's funny you should say that. Years ago, I had a lady that I dated when I was in college. She became the director of this big organization and wanted to hire me as a speaker. And she was asking me about, well, give me some statistics about some of your marketing efforts that you put together. And I said, well, I've had literally between 80 and 90% success rate with these dimensional marketing campaigns. And she looked at me and she said, to your point, she goes, my audience just won't believe that. They just won't believe it. But, I said, but I have statistics. She goes, they won't believe it. So, yeah, to your point, I think there's a lot of skepticism there as well.
Here's a story. I recently talked to a chief customer officer that came on to the podcast, and he was talking about a conversation he had the day before. And the day before, he was talking to his customer, chief information security officer. And that CISO had just gone through a review on a new portion of their tech stack, right? So CISOs are not defined by being a buyer, right? None of our buyers are defined they're not professional buyers. They have jobs. And then every once in a while, right, they have to purchase something and now they go through the evaluation process, right? And they're kind of doing it on the side because we have already too much to do in a day, right? But here's what he said. He said, we evaluated 14 different companies. They had an RFP they put out and said, here are the 10 things that we want to make sure that your tech platform does. Every single one of those 14 competitors came back and said, we can do every one of the dimensions that you've outlined in your RFP. He said it was a complete sea of sameness, right? So if you think about it, right, as sellers, we're never going to go in. We're not going to go in and say, hey, we do a really good job on 8 of those 10. 2 of them, we're not so good, right? That just doesn't happen. So you look at it from that environment, you're like, okay, if they're going to just position themselves in the best possible light, no matter what, how do I get real information? How do I get critical thinking and how to evaluate them? But you know what he said that he wanted to know most of all? He said, I wanted to know this. He said, I want to know what it's like working with you after I make the purchase, what the experience of working with you is like. Yeah. So you put that into context, right? And you think about it, we sometimes like learning from our failures, but by just turning 180 degrees around and looking at it from their perspective, how are we helping them sift through this sea of sameness? How do we understand this is something they're doing on the side? How do we help them authentically come to a conclusion and make a purchase decision? If we think about it that way, it's kind of like a different lens that we're putting it through, right?
Yeah. It's kind of sad, though, if you stop and think about it, that 74% of the people don't trust what marketing is saying. That in itself is a massive hurdle to get over, because even if you're real and authentic and honest and transparent and the others aren't, you're still lumped into the same bucket. So, that's a very interesting proposition. How do you navigate those waters? Very important.
This is something that it'll blow you away. So another B2B CMO that came on, he said, our number one best performing piece of content that the sales team has just grabbed onto was when they produced a bit of content, an article that talked about how they failed and how they learned. Exactly how you opened up this whole podcast here, right? And it was like, the sales team was like, we can't do that. We can't admit that we failed, right? Why would you do that, right? And he said the ones that actually took the leap of faith and said, okay, I'm going to send it out. He said such incredible conversations came back, and it was like a breath of fresh air. Because just like that woman that you talked about, nobody's going to believe it when you say we're perfect, right? And when you say that we're not, but at least we know how to learn from that situation, right? Then they're like, okay, now I'm having an authentic conversation and dialogue with you, right? But that's a pretty scary proposition to put out there and say, we don't bat 1,000.
When you say that, it brings back a memory that I had a very dear friend of mine said in my one of my keynote addresses, and I was telling people, just like I mentioned at the onset of this call, I've failed many times. And I've learned, and I continue to fail, and I do these things. And he said to me afterwards, he said, "You know something? You should never really talk down about yourself like that." I said, "I will tell you that I believe it creates a deeper connection with the audience." And people actually said in the evaluations, "Man, I connected with him so well," because he wasn't trying to set himself on a pedestal above everybody, but the words were, he was authentic. And I said, "Rick, this is why I do this. Not because I'm trying to be self-deprecating, but I'm doing it because I want people to know that it's okay to fail. It's okay to make mistakes. And it's okay to be authentic about it, because then you're real. Then you're real." And it just, boy, what you said when you made that comment, it just really struck a nerve with me that I had that happen to me probably 20 years ago.
Well, think about it this way. If you're a CRO and you're addressing your sales team and you say, you know what, nobody believes that you're perfect. Nobody believes that you don't make mistakes. But I want you to get out there and I want you to sell like you never made a mistake before, right? Like that's basically what we're saying, right? It's basically we're saying nobody's going to believe the way that we're going to sell, but let's just keep doing it, right? And we're going to be part of that sea of sameness out there. Let's go do it. Let's hit our and let's get our quotas and let's like beat it, right? It's like you think about it, all they want to do, they want to have real authentic conversations, and they want to have conversations where you actually help them. You provide value. They don't want to come on and like educate you on their product and their industry. They want you helping them. They want you helping them understand the big issues like you're doing today for the entire B2B C-suite, right? We're taking apart some of the biggest challenges and saying there's a different way we've got to look at this. That same conversation the buyers want us to have with them, right? And not just during the sales process, afterwards as well, right?
Yeah. Do you recall when you and I first had that conversation? It kind of brings up the story I told you about my dad and how. Yeah, well, I was in my dad's office when I worked with him at a very large concern, New York concern, and the salesman came in and started just bellowing about how wonderful their company was, and then started asking my dad questions about where he worked, the company, what the company does, and he pretty much kicked the guy out of his office. And I was like, "What? What was that all about?" He goes, "It's not my job. It's not my job to teach him about my company. It's my job to fill in the blanks." And when somebody comes to me and when I know that they've taken the time to learn and understand about what I do, looking at my collateral, checking out my website, looking at social media and all that, and then I'm just filling in the gaps, and you can tell by the questions that they're asking. He goes, "I'm interested in working with someone like that. Not interested with somebody that's just trying to sell me something." There was a guy named Joe, God rest his soul. He was an amazing speaker out of Texas. His name was Joe Charbonneau. And he said that buyers read sellers at 72,000 images a second. And they know if you're there on a mission to sell or to help them. And I'll tell you, I never forgot that. I never forgot that.
Yeah, it's like you develop another sense, like a seventh sense, right? When somebody's just trying to sell, right? Versus trying to really authentically help. It makes such a huge difference. You know, here's the question is, how do we get to that point? You don't come in value selling is not new, right? That's not a insight selling or that's nothing new to our industries. What is in your mind the biggest challenge to getting to the point where we can authentically do that value insight selling, right? It's what like the Gartners of the world call the, trusted advisor. You don't become a trusted advisor just because you learned about your product's feature set and you looked at a competitive analysis and you knew how to sell. You know how to sell on a feature basis, right? It's much more than that. And I think we should start devoting some time here to how do we get to this point? How do we do it like to the point where your dad kicked the guy out? If he had come in and actually been that trusted advisor, like what does it take to be that trusted advisor these days?
Well, in my opinion, I think from my position, it's really understanding the client to the best of your ability, especially if it's someone that's new. And then not making assumptions, but asking questions, asking the key core questions. I mean, liken it to go to a doctor. You go to the doctor, you have a pain in your head, and the doctor says, hang on a second, and he calls his secretary to schedule surgery for you. All of a sudden, not so much a trusted advisor. But if they ask questions, have you had a problem? Did you fall? How long you've been experiencing it? Now all of a sudden you're starting to relax and believe in this person that they genuinely have your best interest at heart. So from my perspective, when it comes to sales, just because if somebody presents me with an RFP, that's not enough for me. Sure, I can do those things, but I want to know more about the company. Where have their failures been? Why are they doing this RFP? What is there something that has been presented to you in the past that has been negative, that hasn't worked? I want to know those things so that I can put my best foot forward. And then looking at something like that, how do I look at ways that we can go over and above for that particular customer and helping them? I love what you said about that experience afterwards. That's something that I'm going to take away from this call today myself.
Well, here I've got what you just said there. I got a whole new analogy to think about that you just made there. So I spent years doing healthcare marketing, and it was always about the doctors. People wanted the doctors to have a good bedside manner, right? Doctors so often would come in, and I'm going to link this over to the value of selling in just a second. Doctors will come in and like, I got the PhD. Yeah, I treat patients every single day. I got the knowledge. Tell me what your issues, and I'm going to tell you how to fix it, right? Where the patient came in and said, hang on a second, there's nobody that's a bigger expert than me and how I feel and how this, the dynamics of my entire body and the symptoms and how it plays out. And I want to tell you more about what's going on with me instead of getting a quick diagnosis from you so you can sign the chart and you can get to the 58th patient that you saw today, right? So now think about it as sellers, as the doctors. They come in, right? And we want to be the knight in the shining armor. We were like, here's what it is. Here's how we're so great. Here's how we can help you. But all the buyer really wants is to be able to have a conversation back and forth. They want to be able to input too. They want to be able to say, hey, we're the expert in our business. You may work with a lot of companies like ours, but guess what? Here's what's going on in my business, right? And here's what I think. Here's what's important to me, right? We all know, and this has been Gong proved this. They did a huge study with thousands and thousands of sales calls, and they found that the sales rep talked 2/3 to 3/4 of the time. Way too much. That means if you're going to talk that much, guess what's going to happen in the other quarter when the prospect talks? They're just going to be reflecting back to what you said, right? There is no deep learning there. So the analogy you did with the healthcare, I love that. We can't be the typical doctor coming in and just knowing we know exactly what to do with getting this much info from you.
Well, it reminds me of that quote that says, prescription without diagnosis is malpractice.
All right. Just give me another layer to the analogy. Well, let me dive into this, okay? Because Here's what I think is part of the problem is that we, in order to be the doctor that knows deeply about that patient, right? The business analogy is we need to know deeply about our ICP, our ideal customer profile, both from our customers and our prospects. But here's what happens in the typical business environment, we set up customer learning programs through existing business processes that were designed to do something very different. I'll give you an example, the sales process, right? So there is a massive shield that is up when I'm a salesperson selling you. There's only so much that you're going to divulge, right? Because you're being sold to right now. You're not talking about deep issues and challenges and here, Steve, I just don't know, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, right? You're being sold to and you're being talked at 2/3 to 3/4 of the time. So you would never run a deep customer learning, ICP learning program through an existing sales process. Same thing with customer success, right? There's three things that customer success reps try to do: put out fires, answer questions, and cross sell and upsell, right? So again, it's a very different environment. It's why most CMOs, when they take on a new role, all they do is they start out and say, I'm going to spend the vast majority of my time, I'm going to call and I'm going to talk to customers. No agenda. I just want to learn, right? Now that's deep learning. But the problem is the role of a CMO is pretty demanding and you stop after a while, right? But our ICP is complex and always changing. So the question I have here is how important is a true, deep, ongoing ICP learning program within the company in order to fuel that, that value insight selling?
I mean, it sounds pretty basic, the answer I'm going to give you, and it's critical. I mean, I don't know that you can do it without it. I mean, for instance, I mean, that's where the value, I believe, of like testimonials come in. And not only let me backtrack, not testimonials, but surveys, for instance. Understanding, and that goes to the after experience. I mean, how many people, I asked my client, when was the last time you asked your customer how you're doing, how you can improve, how you can improve? I mean, we all think that we're doing a great job. I remember doing a presentation once, and a buddy of mine came up afterwards, and I'm thumbing through the surveys, and he's like, "What are you doing?" I'm saying, "I'm looking for all the negative comments." He goes, "But Cliff, that was great." I go, "Guarantee you, there's going to be something in here that I can learn. Guarantee." And be darned if it wasn't. Every time I speak, there's something that I can find, and so asking those. Being willing to ask the hard questions on how can we improve, what are the things that what could we do better, and along the lines I think are critical. Yeah.
So there's a new trend that's happening, right? As B2B businesses, we have more data than we have ever had before. I mean, we have engagement data, we have product usage data, we have data from the marketplace, we have data from our vendors that if we ask, right, that we can get. We have so much data that I ask when I do these podcasts and we're almost up to 50 C-suite executives where I've asked the question, what are the two most important or critical challenges that you need to address to create long-term sustainable growth? The number one challenge is defining the ICP, but the second part of that is through data, right? Organizing and accessing and bringing all the data together in order to better understand the ICP. Now, what that means to me is that's critical, absolutely, but we're missing a major component, which you're talking about here, which is just the conversation, right? The art of the conversation. And it's almost like that has been replaced by the art of digital transformation and the data that we can get, right? And nobody is saying the data isn't important. Absolutely critical. But how critical is it to have those conversations too?
Now I wanted to backtrack and ask you a question. How frequently do you find that companies are actually analyzing that data.
They're not. They're overwhelmed with data. And data lives in all kinds of different silos in spreadsheets or PDFs or output that nobody's even ever looked at. That's why it was the number one challenge. It was tied to understanding the ICP. That was the number one challenge. But the way that it was characterized was through data. The idea was that we can kind of solve that problem by better organizing and using the data that we have. And I would agree. That's a massive input. It's a massive challenge. But I guess my question here is, in my mind, the data only takes you so far, right? Having a real conversation. In fact, we had a woman on, she's a three-time B2B CMO, and she is a value accelerator advisor for Goldman Sachs. And she said the number one thing, if you want to develop pipeline, the number one thing that you have to do, you have to have conversations with your customers. And you should be doing that with 20% of your time. So that's my question for you is how important in this entire process, right? Our go-to-market strategy, really everything, every aspect of the go-to-market strategy, how important is it to have those conversations and stay in touch with our ICP?
Like I said a moment ago, I think it's critical. Without it, you're shooting blind. You really are. Because companies are evolving all the time. And if you are looking at someone, I think back to the experience with my dad. If you're looking back at a company and thinking that it's operating the same as it did 5 years ago, a year ago, you're wrong. And so and this is, market segmentation. I'm big on classifying clients and working with my top tier and really hitting them in various levels, having conversations like this, doing surveys, having questionnaires, getting them involved in different types of group chats together and things like that. I do think that it is absolutely critical because even if you learned one nugget, and oftentimes if you learn one nugget about one organization, it's also creates a talking point the next time you're working with someone else, maybe in the same vertical market, so that you can have that conversation. My experience talking to my other client is they experience this. Do you have the same issue? Well, then that level of conversation definitely opens up a world of opportunity.
I have to ask you because we've talked about so much here. I want to get your opinion on the single most important takeaway that you want the B2B C-suite audience that's consuming this podcast to take away from our conversation today. What's the one most important thing?
I would say the critical importance of being authentic. Authenticity, I think, trumps most things because we have so few people. You said one thing, but I think they run hand in hand. Accountability and authenticity. Be accountable and be authentic. And I don't think you can lose.
Yeah. I thank you. I have sometimes 3, 4, 5 minute responses to that question when I run the podcast. There's about 15 things in there, but we need to boil it down to what do we do differently? What are the simple changes, right? If you can be accountable and authentic, and you just had that as a filter of how you approached everything you did, right? I think it would change fundamentally the way that we run our businesses and our success. So, wise words there for us to take away. And I know one thing, there's going to be more questions that people have. Would it be appropriate if I gave out a link to your LinkedIn profile that people could reach out to you?
Absolutely. By all means. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, good. Well, the mission of this podcast is to bring together C-suite executives from B2B companies from across the world, share our perspectives, share our insights, and help our peers. And if we can do that, it's the rising tide that lifts all boats. And I think you did that in a big way today. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. And thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.